So let's go back to the idea of complicated grief. And I want to just point out here that we use the term complicated is not a great term because it's something, complicated means complex or intricate or difficult to solve or something like that in everyday life. And a lot of people use the term complicated grief in that way. They think of complicated grief that some people say isn't all grief complicated. And yes, it is. All grief is complicated in that sense. But that's not the sense we're using it here. Here we're using the sense in its medical, or rather the term in its medical sense, which is a complication in medicine is a process that interferes with the course of natural healing. So if you can think of a wound complication, you can think of having a pneumonia after you have a heart attack or something. Those are complications. And that's the kind of complication we're talking about here because we're talking about something that is interfering with the natural healing process. So just to remind you, the model here is that bereavement naturally triggers both acute grief and a mourning process to basically help us come to terms with the loss and to transform that acute grief. For some people, though, bereavement also triggers what we call complications, and these typically are certain kinds of thoughts, primarily second-guessing kinds of thoughts, people who are thinking to themselves, I should have done this, or someone else should have done something, and then the person wouldn't have died, or the person's death would have been easier or better or different in some way. But the focus is on the if only, we call that counterfactual thinking in psychology. So that's one kind of problem. Another one is the urge, which is very natural, to try to protect oneself from the painful reality by trying very hard to avoid it. And pretty much everyone does this, and some of this is perfectly fine. Maybe it's even helpful because we can't process this incredible, emotionally painful information all at once. So we need to be able to set it aside, but we also need to be able to go back to it. And it can't be the primary way that we choose to take care of ourselves. For most people, that causes a lot of problems. I'll kind of try to explain that a little more, and then you can also ask questions if you don't understand it. Because this is one of the things I want to say that people naturally, when someone is upset, like I said before, they don't want them to be upset. So if someone is upset going to the movie theater that they used to go to with the person who died, lots of times their friends will say, well, don't go to that movie theater, honey, go to another one. But that's really, maybe that's a good idea as a temporary measure. This is not an extreme thing, but eventually you're going to want to go back to that movie theater, okay? Otherwise, your life, if it's someone you loved, it's not going to just be the movie theater. It's going to be pretty much everything in your entire world. And so if you make the decision that you're not going to do something because it's too upsetting, how are you going to decide which something it's going to be? And before you know it, your entire world has become so constricted that you can't really function. And you haven't given yourself the opportunity to really understand the consequences of this loss. Okay, and then the third thing is that we need to be able to manage these roller coaster emotions in some way. And yes, we can experience them, but if they get a hold, and this is where the self-compassion comes in, because we have to be able to keep them in perspective, and we have to be able to let ourselves also think about and enjoy the positive things in our lives, even if we can only do it briefly and intermittently. Because if we don't, if these things take hold, what happens is they block that process of mourning, transforming acute grief to integrated grief, and what we get is the symptoms of complicated grief, namely the persistence of acute grief, which is a very, very painful and debilitating kind of state of mind, really, and then accompanied by these kind of incessant and sort of compulsive almost behaviors and incessant kinds of thinking. So based on this model, we developed the treatment, okay? So I think you'll see that what I just said, this is what I just said, right? Another way of saying it, it's just pictured slightly differently here. that bereavement triggers acute grief and the complications interfere with it. So if you were developing a treatment, what would you do? I'm sure you would want to resolve those complications, right? If you believed this model and you wanted, it makes logical sense, right? And the only other thing we do is we try to do what we can to facilitate the natural healing process. So that's the basic idea. Here are the components of the treatment. It's a 16-session treatment with, if you have any awareness of what these are, elements from CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, interpersonal therapy, motivational interviewing, and we have manualized this treatment and tested it in 2 now NIMH-funded studies. The one that Stephanie participated in is now completed, and today I learned that the paper reporting the results was accepted in JAMA Psychiatry, so it will be published sometime in the next few months. Thank you. So basically what we do is a group of procedures that are focused on coming to terms with the loss, which is, remember, one of the 3 things we need to do. Actually, these are also techniques that help us reconfigure our relationship with the person who died, so both of those. And then in each and every session, we do 1 or more of these procedures, which are focused on restoration of a meaningful life. And that's basically the treatment. I wanted to show you that the sessions tend to be very structured. The whole treatment is pretty structured, which often actually turns out to be, it's something that many therapists, especially grief therapists, or not especially grief therapists, probably especially other therapists who don't know grief so well, but they often feel like, well, you should just let the person talk because you want to listen and you want to be empathic, and that's absolutely true. But it turns out that someone who is so activated emotionally usually appreciates a kind of structure to an approach like this. So the session starts with certain procedures. It moves from the beginning, introductory sort of minutes, basically 5 to 10 minutes, to work in some way on the loss focus, and then work on the restoration focus, and then an ending of the session. And actually, part of the ending is plans for the upcoming week, because a lot of this treatment does entail people going home and putting into action various kinds of things that we have decided together that they will do. And this is critically important to the treatment primarily because if you don't take the treatment into your life, if you're suffering and you don't take the treatment into your life, you just keep coming weekly to see me or anybody else, you really aren't going to benefit from what we're saying. It's not enough to just talk about it once a week. It needs to be implemented. So we do emphasize that. So that's the basic structure. I want to tell you a little bit about the core principles and the sort of philosophy underlying this treatment, and then in a little bit in this section about the what I mentioned in the very beginning, the part of our minds that operates out of our awareness, and that's called the adaptive unconscious. So there are 4 core principles here. One is that what I've been saying, that people have a natural inborn capacity to adjust to a loss, even the most difficult loss, and it utilizes this adaptive unconscious. So we don't necessarily know that it's happening. Our minds will help us along if we don't get in the way. And we can also facilitate adaptation by receiving meaningful support. We really almost have to have that, I would say, by practicing self-compassion. And not, because if we don't, what's happening is we're feeling very emotional and we're telling ourselves, stop it. You know, you're being ridiculous, or you're being childish, or why are you so weak, or you can't let anyone else see this, or any of those kinds of things are going to be just going to make the whole process so much more difficult. And we have to honor the what are called self-determination needs that I was talking about before, the sense of belonging and mattering, the need for that sense of belonging and mattering. That's not a weakness, that's not a dependency, that's a basic human need. A need to connect with our authentic self, which we do have, even though we're not feeling like we have it, and to meet meaningful challenges In other words, to be willing to do these kinds of things, actually in this situation is one of those. So a word about the adaptive unconscious and why it's important. So what is it? Well, this is a set of brain mechanisms that protect our sense of self and sense of competence and integrity and feelings of worthiness in the face of threats to that, of negative experiences like bereavement. And interestingly, this is what, we always knew, at least I grew up hearing that no one knew what 90% of our brain did, that we always knew that we only used 10% of our brains. That's true, and this is the other 90%. And actually what we've learned recently is that actually it's in charge. We think we're in charge, but we're not. It's this adaptive, hopefully adaptive, but it's sometimes called implicit processes. This is a whole other discussion, but it is very, very important in our lives in many, many ways, and I think including in grief. So why is it important? Well, one of the reasons it's important actually is that it's not too good when we fail to recognize it. And this, what I'm going to tell you now, comes from work. The slide has these references by Dan Gilbert, who some of you may have heard on a TED Talk. He gives a wonderful TED Talk. He's been on Colbert. He's a riot on Colbert. He studies happiness. And he often collaborates with someone named Timothy Wilson, who wrote a very accessible, wonderful book called Strangers to Ourselves, which is basically what I was just saying. It's all about these processes that occur under the surface that we're not aware of, but how they're very much in charge, which also some of you may be familiar with. Daniel Kahneman's work also very much pertains to this. And if you like Malcolm Gladwell, Blink is also about these same processes. But when coming back to bereavement, one of the things that Gilbert and Wilson have learned is that we often expect, when something bad happens, to be more unhappy than we turn out to be. And that expectation can actually undermine us. We also may fail to recognize something that they have consistently found, which is that the adaptive unconscious, the way that this underlying process works to help us, is actually more activated when the worse the thing is that happens. So if you have some little problem, it's a little bit activated. If you have a big problem, like being bereaved, it's very activated, unless you stand in its way. And that's the other problem. If you don't know about it, then you may not have faith in remember, you're feeling as though nothing is ever going to be okay again. And if you listen to that feeling as opposed to understanding that it's not true, you can end up trying to do things that end up standing in your way. Okay, last thing, we go back to the philosophy that grief is a form of love, and we encourage people who work with us to accept grief into their lives. And we can do that. You can accept it into your life by enduring it or by embracing it. And we basically feel that it's much better to weave grief into our lives, and that's what we actually do naturally in the natural process, rather than try to force it out or get over it. Grief contains love and the loss, and so it's a way of keeping our loved ones with us, even as we remake our lives without it, and even as we let it kind of naturally subside in intensity. It's not going to go away completely. Embracing grief is a form of self-compassion, and it can help us by embracing grief, by accepting it as at least as a neutral, if not a positive thing in our lives, can help us allow others in too. And that's, as we said, very, very important. So I wanted to end by showing you the results of our first study, the way that we look at them as researchers, just because I thought you might find it a little bit interesting. What this shows you, we compared this treatment to interpersonal psychotherapy, which is a very good psychotherapy approach that's been proven efficacious lots and lots of times for depression. And these are the people who, we had a measure of responding to the treatment. And if we took everybody, including anybody who dropped out of the treatment, we had 51% of the people who got CGT, even if they dropped out, got better, and 28% of the, this is a very stringent, these kinds of studies, it was a very stringent comparison. And if they completed the study, 66% of these individuals improved. And that's a very strong finding. So I was going to end, I don't know, Lori, what do you think? I was going to end showing you a couple of video clips, but I'm thinking we should maybe turn to questions and answers instead. Okay? So I will end at this point, and thank you very much for your attention.